How do I hydrate for my long run? We all know as runners that we're supposed to hydrate when we're exercising with any intensity or for any duration. We also, most of us know that we should be including electrolytes in some way, but if we're honest, we really don't know how much we're supposed to drink or how much electrolyte we're supposed to have. So what we're going to talk about today is a starting point for a basic 101. What should you do in terms of a hydration strategy so that you can then go forward and iterate on it and make it better and more specific to you? Now, sweat losses in terms of fluid can range in runners anywhere from just a few ounces, so like 200 milliliters, all the way up to like 100 ounces, which is like 3 liters. So obviously you have very light sweaters at the low end and very heavy sweaters at the top end. And these runners at either end of this spectrum can't use the same hydration strategy in terms of replenishing their fluid losses when they're so drastically different. That being said, sweat rates in terms of fluid loss exist on a bell curve among runners. So if you take 100 runners in a room, only a few of them are going to have very low sweat rates. And only a few of them are going to have extremely high sweat rates. The vast majority, obviously, are going to have average sweat rates. And that's what we're going to talk about today. A hydration strategy for that average runner, which makes it a good starting point, because working with athletes myself, I know that the majority of runners really don't have any strategy. So if we can get a good starting point, and then you can get more sophisticated with it going forward. So if you've got this bell curve among runners where you've got very low sweat rates and you've got very high sweat rates, so very sweaty runners and not sweaty runners, what's the average runner? How much fluid does the average runner lose as sweat each hour? And the answer is about 1 liter, which is about 34 ounces. And because we're just trying to get in the ballpark here, we can just round that down to 32 ounces, because most of you guys have seen 32-ounce water bottles or 16-ounce water bottles, which are the really common ones. So if you imagine 2 of those, you're losing about 2 of those per hour as sweat. So I've got one here for those of you watching the video. This is a 16-ounce water bottle, and 2 of these every hour is being lost as sweat by the average runner as they run. So if we're losing 2 small water bottles worth of sweat every hour as we're running, how much of that do we need to replace? Now, we're going to come to electrolytes in a second. I want to deal with that separately. But the short answer is that a good rule of thumb for a starting point is to replace about half of your fluid losses. So if you're sweating out 2 small water bottles per hour, which is about 32 ounces, a good rule of thumb would be to replenish with 16 ounces per hour, which will be like 1 small water bottle. And that's pretty much it. That is a really good starting point in terms of how much fluid to replace when you're running. If you think you're probably average in terms of sweatiness, right? You're not a really sweaty runner and you're not a really light sweat runner, then aiming for about 1 small water bottle per hour of fluid replenishment is a good starting point for your long run. That's going to equate to about 500 milliliters for you metric people, or about 16 ounces for you imperial guys. And then the next question is electrolytes. So most of us know that we should be replenishing electrolytes in some format when it comes to hydration. However, we really don't know what. So some of us might stick some of those electrolyte tablets in our water bottles, but we don't know how much and what's right and what we need. So again, what we're going to try and do is give a good starting point that you can then iterate from today. So in the same way as you can have a really sweaty runner and a really not sweaty runner, you can have runners who have really salty sweat, and you can have runners who have very little salt in their sweat. And obviously, runners with very salty sweat need to replace more of those electrolytes than runners with very low saltiness in their sweat. Now, there are very specific ways that you can work out a good hydration and electrolyte strategy that I talked about at length in one of my podcast episodes with Andy Blow. So I'll put a link to that episode in the description below. And I also will link to another episode where I give a practical example of how to implement the strategy that he recommends in that episode. But that is very sophisticated and really like the 102. Okay, so that's the next step after you take this 101 step of just getting a basic hydration and electrolyte strategy. So the spectrum of, if we come to sodium versus the other electrolytes first, because there's potassium, magnesium, sodium, and some calcium and some other stuff. And when you look at the electrolytes that you can buy from the running store, it's difficult to know what you should pay attention to. Now, it's not that the other electrolytes are not important at all, but the one that we lose the most of that we need to really pay attention to is sodium. And as long as we're getting our sodium replenishment about right, the other stuff is probably going to be about right too. So when it comes to sodium, you can have losses at the low end in your sweat, so very not salty sweat, which is only like 200 milligrams per liter of sodium. And then at the high end, you could have extremely salty sweat, which has about 2,000 milligrams per liter of sodium. Again, very different strategies for those with very little salt in their sweat versus very high amounts, not salt, sodium in their sweat. But again, if we're going to have a starting point, what does the average runner have? Okay, the average runner has about 1,000 milligrams of sodium per liter in their sweat. So that is a really good place to start. So if you're going to be drinking one water bottle per hour, like one small water bottle, 16 ounces per hour, you want to put 1,000 milligrams per liter of sodium in this. So when you go to buy your electrolytes, you want to look at the packet and you're looking for things that say 1,000 milligrams of sodium per liter, or it might say 1,000 Na, which is the chemical symbol for sodium. And a couple of companies that I like to recommend would be LMNT. So I've got one here. There's a sachet here and it's got the number 1,000 on it. It says 1,000 milligrams of sodium. So all I would do is take this sachet, stick it in this water bottle, and that's what I drink, one of those each hour when I'm running my long run. Another company that I really like is Precision Fuel and Hydration. I don't have any of their 1,000 milligrams sachets, but I've got a 1,500 milligram sachet here for those of you watching the video. So I would take the 1,000 milligram one that I don't have right now, and I would dump that in the water bottle. And the reason I like companies like LMNT and Precision Fuel and Hydration is because they have electrolyte tablets and sachets with higher sodium concentrations than is typical. So some of the other electrolyte drinks you might see, so something like Gatorade is going to have about 200 to 250 depending on what you buy. Noon tablets, they're going to have about 250 to 300, I think. They're not very clear in their labeling. Tailwind, I think, is about 250 or 300 milligrams per liter. So these are much lower concentrations when you compare them. So they're between 200 and 300 for your Noon, Noon, Gatorade, Tailwind are about 200 to 300 milligrams per liter of sodium, whereas LMNT and Precision Hydration, they're up at 1,000. So that's why I'm typically going to recommend those electrolyte sachets and tablets as opposed to the sports drinks or the Noon tablets. That being said, those brands might not be available where you are. So what you're going to do is look at the sachet of whatever electrolyte packet you're buying and see, is it around 1,000 milligrams per liter? And now we have a really good starting point. So we're going to replace about half of the fluid we lose. We lose about 1 liter per hour, which is about 32 to 34 ounces, which is 2 typical small water bottles. So we lose 2 of those per hour in our sweat, and we're going to try and replace half of it. So we're going to try and replace 1 small water bottle per hour. So that's what we're going to drink. And to replace the sodium, we want to aim for electrolyte tablets that have usually labeled on the packet 1,000 milligrams, which means 1,000 milligrams per liter. And all you're going to do is dump the tablet or the sachet in that small water bottle and drink 1 of those per hour. Now that's going to give you a really good starting point if you are an average runner with average sweat rate and an average saltiness of your sweat. And then you can iterate on that. So on hotter days, you can drink more. If you think you're a slightly higher sweater, you can drink a bit more. If you think you sweat a bit less than that, you can drink a bit less. And then experiment, see how it goes. See if you have any symptoms to do with low hydration or electrolytes, things like malaise, cramping, certain kinds of bonking, slow recovery, that kind of stuff. Or if you think you're a bit overhydrated, so potentially things like headaches or going to the bathroom during your long run, like multiple times. And so then you're going to try and customize from this starting point. But I think this is a really good starting point for the average runner so if you have already worked on your hydration strategy quite a bit, this is probably not the strategy to go for you. But if you literally have never given it any thought, going for 1 small water bottle with 1,000 milligrams per liter of sodium in it is a really good place to start for hydrating your long run. And then if you want to get more sophisticated, which I recommend you do once you've got used to this starting point, check out the links in the description to those podcast episodes. The one with Andy, where we interview him and talk in depth about all of the science behind this and why it is a good idea to do it in a more precise way. And then the episode that I did on my own, where I talked about how to implement those strategies more exactly and use a spreadsheet and record and weigh yourself before and after runs and all of this kind of stuff. But that's really the next step. The first step is just to start hydrating with a little more precision, and this is a good way to start. And if you're interested in dialing it in even more specifically and working with us to optimize not only your hydration strategy, your electrolyte strategy, your fueling strategy, your pacing strategy, your training zones, your strength training, and all of these kind of things. These are the kind of things that we help runners with every day, and we'd love to talk to you. So if that's you, just click the link in the description to book a free call and we'll have a chat.